Okay, looks like we have everyone that we're expecting today, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We're looking at here our main screen, our main dashboard that everyone is able to see, and we're going to start off by kind of showing you a day in the life, or kind of how our market analysts go into SONAR and get their pages set up and start looking at different data sets within SONAR. So first, we start here in the add page function in the bottom left-hand corner, and we're going to bring up a outbound tender rejection of the overall US market. And the reason that we're doing that is kind of our first look into what's happening on a daily basis, is to give us just a kind of a high-level overview of what's happening, the overview of the market, and you know, kind of give us an idea of where we can start at in the mornings with the outbound tender rejection. As we navigate through this outbound tender rejection index screen, we have the ability to add what we call callouts, which Zach is adding right now, noting some of these volatile changes, if you will, in the tender rejection index, which for those of you that are just joining us for the first time, the tender reject index is calculated by a percentage of the overall electronically tendered electronic tenders in the US market. And I'm gonna pass over to Zach here for a few minutes to kind of go over in a little more detail what this overall US tender rejection index is showing you.
Thank you, Brad. So basically, this is how I kind of start my day. I look at the outbound tender rejection index for the country, basically looking to see what's happening right here. So if I see any large movements, I know that I need to go find some specific markets that are making this happen. This is a good place to start, just to look at the general market activity. What we saw back in the early spring, we saw a bunch of rejections. So it's a good point of relation to see where it's been and where it's going. As you can see, we're creeping back up into that early spring, or that late spring, sorry, area where we had elevated rejections. Now, if you look back here in January, it was at a peak of rejections. And as things kind of came through the spring, we started seeing this big downward slide. And one of the reasons, I think, if you've been listening, we've talked about how we think a lot of this was due to the contract implementation. So these carriers came in and gave a bunch of rate increases. They started implementing them. So they got out of the spot market as the rates were high enough to start accepting more loads, because they just got a lot of contracts. Now, those contract rates that they were operating on in the late winter, early spring were based on 2016, early 2017 market, which the 2016 market, as a lot of people may know, was not the greatest in the transportation industry. It was kind of it wasn't necessarily a recession, but for transportation, it was sort of a mini little glitch. Fuel prices went way down, driving a lot of production down in the country. So it turned back up quickly in the spring of 2017. And so the market changed so rapidly, the contracts just did not have that information buried in it. So people were operating well below market rates in their contracts, and they just didn't want to use the contract market to move their trucks, because they had plenty of demand for capacity out there. So I've marked a few spots here. The ELD mandate period, again, I think most people have realized this was not a big to do in terms of carrier in the market in general. Like, it didn't have a huge impact to the rating of the market in that short term. It probably had a lot to do with the contracts being elevated before that period of time, but the mandate date itself, the market had already digested that information at the time of the hard mandate. So there was really nothing that changed on April 1st, other than they just started enforcing it. Right now, you see that around holidays, tender rejections do tend to go up right before holidays. If I zoom out here, you'll see back here in December, it elevated quite a bit. And then you'll see out here, we're starting to see, we have no real reason outside of just the general market activity to explain like why this is starting to escalate. So that's a really important piece to note. So I'm seeing that the market looks like it may be about to break through into another segment. Now, if you guys remember, if any of you have been in the spot market or the brokerage or a carrier last year, you'll know that June was a big month. It had the delayed produce season really compressed a lot of capacity in that cycle. The last 2 weeks of June, people were just blowing up with freight. Spot market went haywire. For those of you on DAT, you would have seen the rates spike significantly before retracting in July. We don't think that it's quite as insane as it was last year at this time, but it is something worth noting that June is a hot month, and we'll dive into a few specific markets here in just a minute. So I'm going to turn it back over to Brad to kind of give you another overview as I make another screen, and this is kind of going to give you a flow through or a process.
Sure. Thanks, Zach. Yeah, so as we navigate and Zach kind of gives you the color, I'm going to kind of explain how he's creating these screens and how you can create them yourself. So again, as we go to the add page, to create a custom page in the bottom left corner, we can name our page, which it looks like we're going to call it the Outbound Tender Rejection Index, OTRI markets. We're going to add that page. And please note, when you do add a page, it kicks you back sometimes to that default or that previous page. So you will need to go back and click on the page you just created. And then when it brings you to a blank screen, you'll need to go to that bottom right hand corner plus sign and add what we call widgets that you would like to add. In this case, we are adding these different chart functions. On the left, we're showing you an outbound tender reject index for the Atlanta X market. And again, for those who aren't familiar with these different geographical regions, these X market regions are based on large metropolitan areas and are actually modeled after the DAT's geographical regions. They're X markets. To note, not DAT data in these tender rejections, but created off of the same geographical regions for context for you guys. So here we have an outbound tender reject, again, on the left of the Atlanta X market. We are showing you another outbound tender reject index of the Los Angeles X market, and finally a outbound tender reject index of Chicago. And I think Zach will tell us a little further why he's bringing up these regions, and partly for his and for our market analysts benefit, pulling up and looking at the data from some of the larger markets in the country is very telling of what's happening in various regions of the country. And as you see Zach kind of navigate, and you can pull from any of these charts and size in any which way that you would like to get it exactly to your preference. So with that, I'll pass it to Zach to kind of give you a little better idea why he targets these among many, but these specific markets when kind of doing an overall analysis of the trucking market.
So yeah, thanks. Sorry about the navigation there. I'm operating on a little smaller screen than I'm accustomed to, so it's making things a little bit more compressed to look at. I hope you guys can still see what I'm looking at with decent enough detail though. So some of the biggest hubs in the country are, I mean, whenever you're looking at a big picture market, so you basically want to just start digging down into the information. If you guys remember, the OTRI USA was showing some elevated activity, and it looked like it was moving up. So what you want to go then to the next tier of activity. So the biggest markets in the country are going to be the ones that you want to go to next. And Atlanta, Chicago, Los Angeles, Dallas, for instance, would be a really good one, and Philadelphia and Seattle to an extent are probably the biggest markets in the country in terms of being flow-through hubs. So I've picked 3 of them here. Depending on your screen size, you could pick up to 4 or 5 or however many that you feel like you can easily view on your screen. I've only got 3, and 3 might be a little much to look at on this smaller screen that we've got here. But the point is that you want to pick the markets that you feel are the most relevant to you. So what I'm doing is kind of taking you through my day as I'm looking at the entire market. Like, you may not be totally interested in the Atlanta market, for instance, but if you're looking at the big picture, you really want to pay attention to Atlanta, Chicago, Los Angeles, Dallas, etc. So right now you can see, and this is something we've noticed over the last little bit, it's kind of interesting to watch some of these markets move, because you can tell there's a lot of variation between these 3 huge markets. Now, I've picked very different regions of the country as well, so I feel like we're getting a lot better picture of what's going on in the market. So Atlanta over here is showing you that they are having serious elevation and turn downs over the last, it looks like, week or so. So they've shot up really fast, and that's one thing to note, is whenever a market moves really rapidly, up or down, that's when you really have your chances to see a lot of activity in the spot market. People are slow to move in these markets in general, and slow to react, and slow to see what's happening in individual markets. Now, with this tool, it really gives you a heads up of what's happening with a quickness. It's not pricing based, it's not revenue based, it's activity based. Activity-based measures are generally a lot better to look at in terms of seeing what's actually happening right now in a timely manner. The pricing and revenue models tend to move a little slower because you have pay cycles and financial variables happening that can slow down that process. So what you're looking at right now is what's happening right now. The carriers have really started turning down freight in Atlanta, which means that we're probably going to see some activity in the spot market, and that is definitely something that most carriers and brokers would probably be interested in. Looking over here at Chicago again showing the same kind of big jump. It moved all the way from just over 22% to 25.8%, almost 25% jump in rejections over the course of a week. So the market's starting to really heat up. I think most people kind of already know that the capacity situation is not the best. You're going to see, whenever you see this kind of volatility, though, on a situation that we've been having over the last year with the increased rates that just went into place here in the late or early spring, late winter, and now all of a sudden it's back again. And I think a lot of shippers probably understand this already, that they were already prepped. They knew that this was probably going to happen again, because the volumes that are coming through the market right now are just that intense, and it's very fragile. Not a lot of drivers coming into the space. The average age of a driver is around 55. There's just not enough people moving the freight, and the freight volume, with the economy booming, it doesn't look like it's slowing down right now. So shippers probably got prepped saying we're going to get a rate increase this winter, and then we're going to probably take another one sometime during the year, depending on what the market does in general. And it looks like everybody is still in that space of expecting another rate increase, or they probably should be at this point, because the market looks poised to take another big push into the summer. Now that could all change. We could just be an end of quarter nice summer activity push, but I think if for those of you that watch the economic indicators, the housing starts showed that they were up again, so construction's picking up, and that's one reason we think the Atlanta market is actually moving higher. If you're unfamiliar with commodity flows in the market, the Southeast, and I'm going to make a map here in a minute. I'm going to show you exactly where some commodity flows are happening. And the Southeast is one of the largest providers in the country of wood, next to the Pacific Northwest. And with China reducing its deforestation, we're not going to be importing as much wood, and construction is happening at a rapid pace still in this country. So there's a large need for wood, and a lot of it comes out, it'll flow through Atlanta. And I'm going to make that map here in a minute, but I'll take you over again to Los Angeles as we finish up before I pass it back to Brad and show you guys. So Los Angeles had this big push in May. You can see I've kind of got it compressed here, but you see it took its giant increase in May leading into the Memorial Day weekend. But that's not just Memorial Day. This area was very quiet for a long period of time. It had actually settled more gradually than the rest of the country had. It had not taken the big dive in April that a lot of these other markets had. Like Atlanta took a big dive in April. You see it right there. And Los Angeles was a lot more gradual. So Los Angeles, what we saw happen here was the Chinese New Year. I think everybody knows Chinese New Year has a significant impact on containers, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later in this webinar. Some of the containers came through in mass quantities as the production cycles picked back up in China, and I'm going to show you an index here in a little bit that's going to dive a little bit more deeply into that. But you see that Los Angeles did recover a good bit, and then here it is picking back up again. So something to watch. Container, produce, reefers. We're going to check that out here in a minute. So Brad, I'll kick it back to you, and I'm going to make another chart.
Yep. And as Zach's making his next chart here, as you may have questions as we go through this, please feel free to ask them at any time via the text Q&A, and we will address them here at the end of the webinar. And again, as Zach here goes back down to his custom page function in the bottom left-hand corner, and he has added his log page. And again, that's going to bring him to an empty screen. And then we're going to need to go back to that plus sign, that widget in the bottom right-hand corner, and it populates our 4 different widgets that we have available. We have selected our heat map, and how the heat map works is we're showing you from a commodity flow standpoint, based on the flow of, as we're looking at logs, wood, paper, print, textile, and leather, the number of tons that flow through these regions, and the darker colors, of course, being the regions that experience a higher number of tons from the commodity we're looking at that flow through there. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Zach and have him kind of tell you how this commodity flow is relating to some of the tender reject indexes that we've looked at so far.
So I'm going to keep this one a little bit shorter than the others. Really what I'm trying to do is illustrate a point about if you're a heavy flatbed carrier or something that moves a lot of commodities specific freight, then there's a few of these these commodity flow maps can be quite useful. Right now, they're judging against the national average. Now, something that we may be adding here in the future is, and then this has not yet been installed into this version yet, but is a way to kind of judge like when logs and wood or certain other commodities kind of start spiking in relation to themselves. Like, so these maps right now are very useful if you're really trying to dig into what commodity flows are happening in what part of the country. So remember what I talked to you about Atlanta. So Atlanta, you can see, has a lot of wood, paper, textiles coming through that market. And you see up here in the Pacific Northwest, a lot of forests up here. So once you're clicking through some of these, and you may just keep one of these pages open. I make one of these maps, and I just keep it in this section for just to change and edit around and mess with, when I'm trying to find what commodities are moving where, to see if I can make any connection when I'm digging through. And that's what I did here, is I just made a log map, so I can see clearly Atlanta has got some wood issues going on, and this time of year, that's probably a big deal with all the housing starts and construction in the Northeast. It doesn't start there. They really don't start the building season until it warms up. So just one more little trick to note. You can make these. Obviously we have other commodities, and you can see the coal and mining production, gasoline, fuel oil. These are the areas. Obviously there's going to be weighted differentiation as coal and oil and gas all weigh a little bit different amounts. So this is based on weight. And then again, depending on what you're looking for, you can see we've got this big Midwest presence for electronics and equipment. So it might be a good thing to just have a map flow going on here. So when you get done looking at your individual market indices that you build, you can go to the map real quick and just kind of flow through some of these to see what's actually happening. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Brad, and I'll take you down another road here in a minute.
Sure. So I think next we're going to look at some inbound tender rejection indexes. I feel our focus a lot of times is on the outbound tender rejection index, but also a very good tool to give you a holistic view of the geographical region that we are viewing as the inbound tender reject index, which is showing the electronic tenders that are scheduled to deliver into a geographical region. So as again, in the bottom left corner, we went through to the edit pages, created our iTry inbound tender rejection index market page. Again, brought us back to our blank page, and we hit our plus sign to create or to grab the widget we'd like to show, which we're showing two charts here, and we're showing you now on the left-hand side the inbound tender rejection index into the Chicago X market, which just like the outbound is listed as a percentage or a percent value of tenders being rejected, and they're delivering into that geographical region. And similarly, on the right, we're showing that inbound tender rejection index into that Atlanta X market. And I'm going to turn it back to Zach here to tell you or to give you a better understanding of what exactly these inbound tender rejections can tell you. How do they relate to the outbound tender rejection? How should you view them? He's going to give you a little better idea of how to do that.
So again, I'm going to stay at a pretty high level market views with Chicago and Atlanta, just because we just talked about those two on the O-tries. So what's interesting to me here, like when I'm going through this, I want to know, okay, why are the outbound tenders getting rejected? As I'm going through my progression, or why are my loads getting rejected? What's happening? So the next step, the outbound market is the easiest to kind of comprehend, I think, from a carrier and shipper perspective. The origin, it just seems to make more sense. It's more intuitive. You have specific, like I showed you with the logs and the commodity flows, there's specific regions that do specific activities. So the origin really feels natural to work with. So it's obviously the best place to start. Well, it's not the full picture though. So there's a lot of freight going in and out of markets. So you need to kind of think about it as a whole picture. You want to say, okay, what's happening on the inbound side? So the Chicago market is interesting to me because you have this, not just this elevated outbound situation happening on a shorter scale, you have this inbound tender rejection happening or moving right before the outbound tenders happen with more force. So this is something that you could actually almost see coming as carriers are rejecting loads going into the Chicago market, which to me does not make a good bit of sense, where that Chicago is pretty solid hub lane. It doesn't make sense for people to not want to go to Chicago, especially in the warm time of year, and then all of a sudden nobody's coming out of Chicago. So it looks like capacity may have not been flowing into that market, and now that the warmer months have kicked off, there's no trucks able to move it. So on the other end here, you have Atlanta, which you saw was a big turn down spike, and you see over here that inbounds has actually been moving up too. I mean, it went from, it wasn't as big of a spike of tender rejections, moving from 25.5 to 27, but nevertheless, there's inbound rejections happening at a higher rate than they have been. And that to me signals that the market itself is out of balance. There's a lot of network imbalance happening. And there's, you know, if for those carriers and shippers and brokers and people who are involved in the whole game, it makes them, you know, this should be a tool that they could use to say, okay, maybe I don't need to ship my freight in this market this week, or maybe I need to get it out now, or maybe, and what I'm going to make for you next is adjust my cycle of shipping. So if I can manage my production or have any communication with the production, then I can actually go out there and do something about this. And I'm going to make that for you next as Brad takes over for just another minute.
Sure. And as Zach's making his next page here, I'd like to note our knowledge center in the top right section of under your name dropdown. We've made some changes there. We'll visit that at the end here of the webinar and go over exactly what's in there and how to navigate that as well. But if you have any questions as you're going through the platform, there's a pretty extensive list of all of the data sets that we're showing on the platform, the acronyms we're using. There's actually an acronym list, and there is the airport codes, or the codes that we're defining these geographical regions that Zach is searching when he's searching different indices. And with that, Zach has pulled up a tender lead time indice, which is mapping the time frame from which on a daily showing number of days is how this indice is showed, or is how it's viewed, and it's showing the time frame in which a tender is actually accepted and the scheduled pickup date. So you know how we're showing this one. This one is not on a percentage basis. Also, it is a tender related indice, but not on a percentage basis like the tender rejections. So with that, I'll pass it over to Zach and let him explain a little further how to utilize the tender lead time indices.
Cool. So the tender lead time, again, an indice that's not necessarily, it's not necessarily one that you go to first, but it's certainly one that will give you a better idea of what's happening in a freight market. So like I said before, the OTRI is a good place to start. And then this starts the inbound, and now the tender lead time kind of adds that depth to the information that you're dealing with. So tender lead time is an interesting measure. So basically, as Brad said, it measures the amount of time between the shipper is sending the request over and versus the pickup that they're requesting. So if they say ship out, if they send over this request on June 15th and their pickup request is for June 17th, that's a 2-day tender lead time. So you see here that the tender lead time has moved up on an average by a good bit in this last little bit. So again, this could mean two totally separate things. If shippers are you know, if they're just in an area that they're getting their production out and they're able to get their pickup requests out faster as it relates to production, and it doesn't have to ship out tomorrow or even the next day, they're going to increase their tender lead times just to make sure that there's enough heads up if there's no capacity. On the same scale, you're going to look at the tender lead time, like, well, what if production all of a sudden ramps up and they have a bunch of freight sitting on their dock and they've got to get it out today? So the tender lead time is going to contract. So it's not necessarily a good measure of volume of freight, but paired with an outbound tender rejection, you kind of get a better idea of what's happening. And I'll dive into Atlanta specifically here to give a better understanding. So Atlanta was seeing a 2.31 tender lead time back in early June. So it is not necessarily important what the number is at that time. It's more important about what it's doing. Like, so you have to almost think about it as a moving figure. It's not a static number that you're looking at. You want to look and see, Well, the market itself just averages 2.3 days on general. Okay, that's great, but look what it's done in the last couple of days. It's increased quite a bit. So after being relatively stable, it looks like some of these shippers are actually figuring out we need to go ahead and put out our freight because the tenders are getting rejected, which means if we know that we're going to have a shipment, or maybe they're stepping up their game and saying, you know, we need more heads up, because if I have freight sitting on this dock, I'm going to get in trouble. So the tender lead time has gone up as they start pushing or sending their loads over to say, hey guys, we just need to make sure you can cover this. If not, we're going to start running down our route guides and trying to find other options so we can get this freight moved. And that's all this is really kind of saying to me right now, is that a lot of the shippers in the Atlanta area are worried about capacity, and they need to go out and figure out what to do about it. So it's kind of backing up what we're seeing in the outbound tender rejection index. And with that,
let's stay on that for just a couple more minutes in general, along with the tender lead time. I think that you addressed an important question that we get a lot is, you know, what is an average tender rejection percentage, or what's an average tender lead time? And again, I think if you don't mind going into, pulling up side by side the tender rejection as well, and going a little bit further into not necessarily what is a normal number or what we should be looking for as a normal number, but that we should be trying to monitor the changes and see what the changes are. And that in a tender lead time, an extreme change, or, you know, even somewhat of a change, you know, will have an effect on an outbound tender rejection index, or vice versa. Can you kind of talk about kind of, you know, there's not necessarily an average number, right?
Right.
It's more important, you know, what the change is and how it's trending.
Yeah, so effectively, it doesn't matter. Like if I told you that the average tender rejection for June of last year was 30%, that's okay. I mean, it's a good point of reference. Like I said, it's a good way of kind of looking at it, but it's not necessarily the best way to use this information. The information is really trying to tell you how volatile the market is. And volatility is a moving figure. It's not a static number. We try to do certain statistical measures, and I'm not going to get into all those to really kind of visualize volatility, but volatility is movement. It means that the number is erratic. And so what you're trying to look at here is see just how volatile the market is, because if the market's stable, that means that basically everybody has the information that they need to make the best decisions possible. That means there's, you know, you're going to have streamlined operations. Your shippers are going to know that their trucks are going to be there to pick up their freight. The trucking networks are going to be very efficient. They're going to know that they can get from Atlanta to Chicago without any issues. They're going to have a backhaul from Chicago to Atlanta to get the truck back to where it needs to be, or even, you know, it's going to know its next leg of Chicago to Dallas, or whatever it's going to do. So in stable markets, you don't have a lot of volatility, which leads to a lot of erratic behavior, which is what this is trying to show you. It's trying to show you the erratic behavior. So anytime that you see a chart on here, jump up and down, and also pay attention to the numbers over here, not in what they are at as absolute numbers, but where they have been and how fast they have moved to the spot that they're in. Like 2.49 by itself on a tender lead time in Atlanta is not that meaningful. It does have some value if you're familiar with the Atlanta market, if you're used to seeing, you know, putting your loads out there with a day or 2 day lead times, and you see 2.49, that actually would be a very important number for you to look at. But the way that I'm looking at it today, and for the purposes of this presentation or webinar, is to show you how it can be used in terms of understanding what's happening as the market moves. Like you're really trying to get a better picture of how the market is reacting to what's going on inside it. So right now it's telling me that shippers' behaviors are changing based on what they're seeing in the market. So when the shipper behavior changes, that's a signal to me, without going and talking directly to the shippers themselves. This is a way for me to understand what they're doing. When the shipper changes its behavior, then you can then start to understand why. And with this tender lead time, I kind of understand why they're starting to produce longer lead times. Like I said, with the tender rejection index, good start as they spike. So again, the behavior has changed, and I'm more of a person that enjoys looking at what people do versus what they say anyway. So I'd far rather have some sort of behavioral measure, because that's what these are. These are human behaviors that you're trying to find. They're the ones making the decisions. So if they're telling me the market's stable and I go over here and I see that the tender rejection index is moving high, I know that that's not true. And again, if you're a shipper, you're saying the market's stable. If you're a carrier, you're saying the market is unstable, and therefore I need a higher rate. And this is a good way for either end to kind of have a good idea of what's actually happening, because if anybody's worked on the shipper side, they know that the carriers are going to come to them and say that they need more rates because their costs have increased. And if anybody's worked on the carrier side, the shippers are upset that they can't get capacity, or the service just isn't there. Well, this is a good measure to see exactly what's going on in the broader market. I think I've had a lot of questions about, well, what if there's things that I'm not seeing? Well, if you think about carrier, the transportation industry in general, specifically trucking. So trucking companies have the biggest one has right around 2% of the overall market. That means that the guy with the largest amount of trucks can tell you no more than just 2% of the market. What this is doing is giving you an idea of what's going on in that other 98% of the market. Now, I'm not saying that it's covering 98% of the market, but it is definitely, it's got more than 2% in it, for sure. And that's what it's trying to tell you. It's trying to tell you what's going on in the broader markets. And specifically in these two areas, you're seeing some very specific regionalized behavior. Hope that answers.
Yeah, no, I think that's great. And I think that's a good segue into our next section here. And, you know, maybe certain people saying, I don't ship the certain lanes, or certain carriers, I don't run those certain lanes. Again, it's important to note that you may be affected, or your pricing or your spot market may be affected by some of these bigger regions that are, you know, or more or higher volume regions, if you will, like in Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, for example, may be having a larger effect on your shipping lane, or where you typically move, or the product that you typically move may be the pricing or the capacity in that certain region may be affected by something outside of your knowledge. So I think it's important to note these things and to have, you know, more of a holistic view of the market, so you're aware and can act on things you may not have previously known that will have an adverse effect on you. And with that, we're going to move into and kind of taking on that macro, take that macro view, if you will, of the freight markets. We're going to turn into and look at the some of the ports, some of our container freight indexes, and how they are affecting some of the tender rejections. So we're pulling up here a third-party data source, Freightos Baltic Container Price Index, which is giving us, and this is from China to our American West Coast here on the left, and it is mapping a average 40-foot container, and where you have it pulled up alongside our outbound tender reject index in our Los Angeles X market. And we're looking at, it looks like the last month average here. So I'm gonna pass over to Zach just to give you a little better understanding of how you can manipulate some of this data and use it to understand what's happening in the markets you're operating in.
All right. Sorry about that, Brad. I kind of tripped you up with the, I thought I was going to go to a more unknown or regionalized area, but yeah, I forgot. We were going to talk about Los Angeles. So this is like the big picture type deal. Los Angeles obviously is the biggest port city in the country. with the Port of Long Beach and the Port of LA, and majority of the freight coming from China hits this port city. So one of the things I think we talked about a few times in a few different spaces in our editorial side, we definitely have talked about it. And then I believe I've even talked about it on a few of our market updates and whatnot. But this is one of those things where if you are based in this area, or maybe what your business revolves around is some container freight, well, I think just about any business has something to do with something coming from China. So this is not necessarily a bad measure to look at in general, just to kind of measure what's going on in the general marketplace. You've got the Freightos container price index. So basically what that's telling you is, again, the absolute value is not as important as the movement of this index. So what I'm going to do for you here, and I'm actually going to take off the LA view for just a moment, just so I can kind of do some call outs for what we've seen this year and kind of give a little bit more color. So right here, you have the Chinese New Year. So I think most people that at least have anything to do with containers or sea shipping or anything coming over, that's basically the time in China where it shuts down, production dramatically decreases, everybody goes on vacation, and some of them actually just, they don't come back to their regular jobs. So that process takes a long time. It doesn't just take 2 weeks, it takes about 4 to 6 weeks. So if you see where I'm pointing right here, the lines, this is updated weekly. So each one of these clicks over is 1 week. So let's count it out. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So 6 weeks later, everybody's kind of gotten back into their jobs and into their production facilities, and China kind of starts ramping back up. Of course, it takes a little time for them to build up their inventories and their warehouse volumes before they start shipping with any consistency again. And so that's not just a 2-week process, that's a 4 to 6 week process. And if you look at any of the container volumes, or you keep up with that, every year in May, there's a big push of container volumes hitting the port, because it takes, a week or two for it to start hitting the ports. So what you're seeing here, you see the container price on average, and this is a huge, this is major volatility. Like you ship something for $800 1 week, and the next week it's going for, $250 more. This is a big pile of volatility. So what you're seeing here is that production ramp up, and therefore demand is outpacing supply, the price goes up. And what do you know, in LA, I'm going to add that chart back in here again. Again, LA, I'm kind of picking on you a little bit, but the LA area has a lot more than just containers coming through it, obviously. But this one was a pretty fun chart to look at. So I'm going to kind of manipulate the scale for a minute. And you can see here in May, right after this port, the container prices start spiking, you see this big jump of outbound tender rejection indices. So you got produce obviously happening at one level that everybody already knows about. I'm going to show you guys another index that you can look at if you're highly interested in produce in the LA and West Coast markets. But right now I'm kind of illustrating the container impact. The containers were coming in. With that kind of volatility, that's telling me there's a ton of containers coming in, and there's not like these, the shipping container guys are understanding it, and they're making their pricing adjustments real fast. These guys have been really contented over the past several years to just get you to put containers on their ships. They did not make a lot of money. They didn't make any money before last year, really, for a while. And now they're finally making money again as things are starting to pick up over there. But they're not the quickest to take advantage of a price increase necessarily. Now this volatility is pretty intense. So they're taking advantage. The containers are coming in, they're flooding the ports, sucking up capacity. You got fruits and vegetables happening at about the same time. LA goes from a sleepy little hamlet to a booming Vegas-style tender rejection capital, surging up to just over 19, I believe, 19% in rejections. And now it looks like it's still kind of picking up. And again, this container price is a little, it's a leading indicator, because you have to think about it in terms of the cycle. If you note, the prices started going up well before the tender rejections did. So that's because it's happening over in China, and it takes several days, weeks for it to hit the ports. So you got to think about the container price index as kind of a leading indicator of what's going to happen over here in America. I didn't mean to do that, but there you go.
So we're running a little bit close to the end here, so we're going to jump into our 101 session here and kind of go over in a little more detail how to navigate Sonar and the platform. And then as questions come in, if any do, we will address those throughout. So our first thing is our knowledge center that we'll note in the top right corner under your login name, or under your name in the login in the top right. And you can also, if you have any questions and you need to contact the Sonar team, you can do so via this contact us email address. Otherwise, the knowledge center here will export you to our Sonar homepage, where you will have actually access to any of the webinars that we've done, along with Zach's weekly market updates, which is what you're looking at right now. And as you see here under the documentation, the index guide here on the left, and the index code definitions, which will take you to give you, under the code definitions, will give you a better understanding of what exactly we're displaying here and how you can find them in that list. If I hop back here to our Sonar index guide, this is the full list of how we're displaying all of our data sets, what they're being displayed as, percentage, number of days, whether it be fuel pricing. It's all listed here, and also the amount of time, whether it be daily data, weekly data, is all listed there on this under the knowledge center here, under your name on the top right. So with that, we'll go to our first chart, and I'll show you just a quick trick to help you navigate some of our charting a little bit better. I know some of these symbols, if you're not familiar with, they may be difficult to find or to think of the acronym. A quick, easy trick is just to type in the city that you'd like to look at, and you will be able to see all of the chartable indices that are available there. And then you'll also know what that acronym is, as they're all listed here for Chicago that we're showing. So just a quick kind of shortcut, if you will, to find some of these data sets if you're not super familiar with our acronyms yet. And from there, I will go into, again, our edit page section, as we kind of went throughout the webinar, and how to add there. If you are in one of these default pages or in the dashboard, you'll notice there's no, in the bottom right hand corner, there's no plus sign, because these are preset. You don't have the ability to actually change these default pages. So if I hop back under one of these created my pages, which I'll create another one really quick, just to kind of give you a better idea in case you missed it earlier. We're gonna go to edit in the bottom left hand corner. We're gonna add a page. We will name our page. We will click add. That will populate, it'll kick us back to our previous screen. So I need to click on the page I just created. It will bring us to a blank screen here. And then because we're in My Pages and we're trying to create a custom page, we'll get this widget or this plus sign in the bottom right hand corner. where now we can add any of the different views that we'd like to see. So a map, we can add any number that we'd like. We'll throw a watch list in there. And moving forward with the watch list, as you'll notice, that brings you to a blank screen as well, because it is a completely customizable screen as well. So we need to go to the edit function here on the watch list. And here we need to add the symbols that we'd like to see. So we can add any chartable indice that you like. So for example, we can look at our outbound tender rejection index for the USA. And once you type that in, we need to click that add button. We can, again, as you get a little more familiar with these acronyms, it'll be helpful in adding, of course, in this watch list function. But as you can see, they will be listed once you type in the acronym. And we can kind of go through here and add any number of, maybe we want a fuel index as well, that we want to look at price per gallon, diesel or truck stop price per gallon, fuel index for the US, and maybe we want to see what JB Hunt's doing, for example, if you know, like a separate watch list to look at different truckload stocks. You can add any variation of what you'd like to look at and make sure you hit save, and then you will be able to view all of those that indexes that you added. And from that function as well, if you're interested in seeing a little closer view of what's happening with that index on your watch list, this little chart function here listed next to the tender rejection index that I'm circling is actually exportable to a chart. So you can look at, if I click on that, that will now pull up that index. And again, we can drag from the top of the screen here. As it resizes here, we can size this in any way that we'd like and look at it. And on the x-axis, of course, we can change the time frame in which we'd like to look at. So just give you a little better idea of how to navigate and how to add in my pages. And then as we've created this custom page here on the left, I'm going to click on Save Changes there. So if I leave from that screen, I will be able to come back and view this custom page that I have created. A few new things we've added this week is our surface freight news function, which is showing you various news sources and stories, all exportable. If you click on them, they'll take you to the link there. And these are customizable as well. Again, we're on the default screen, so I cannot customize from there. If I want to create in the bottom left a new page, I can go and create maybe my news page that I'd like to see. I can add that page. It will kick me off that screen, and I'll click back on my news function, bring me to my blank page here, and I will click on my list of widgets, and I'll pull up a news, and I can go in this, let me get rid of this pop-up screen. I can go on this edit page here, and I can click over any of the news sources I would like to view. I can save that news widget, and now on a real-time basis will be updated throughout the day of whatever news sources you would like to see. And again, I'm going to save the changes to that page, so if I leave, my changes will be saved. But I'm going to hop back up to another one of something that's been added since our last webinar is our cross-border freight news section. So we're showing here any global news related to the transportation industry. And again, you have the ability to add these news sources to your customizable page here in the bottom if you are interested. And that is our news widget. How to navigate there. We've gone over our watch list, and I'm going to go a little bit further really quick into our charts and how some of the functionality when navigating our charts and some of the things that Zach was pulling up from the call out standpoint and noting some of the different changes in the market. So I'm just going to pull up with our OTRI acronym and pull up our USA index. And I'm going to show you some of the different, I'm going to get rid of this pop-up widget really quick. I'm going to resize to get all of the data there on this x-axis. And you'll see all of these different options here on the top of the screen. So first, with under this draw button, this pencil will drop down this select a tool from on the left side, the top left of this chart. And here's where Zach was adding earlier. These there's different functions you can do from doodling, drawing. Maybe you want to draw something on your page here. If you want to do one of those call outs that were done to note something that happened in the market, you can do that and list and save. If you don't like how this looks, for example, you'll be prompted. You can just delete really quickly by right-clicking, and same thing here with the market update. You can also change the different font you would like to display. For example, if you're doing a call out or a text box, that can be displayed there, as well as the size of that font. Of course, if you'd like it bold or italicized, and our colors here, and if you'd like to change the line that you're using when in that doodle screen. And these are all these functions are listed again under this draw, this pencil on the top right. Right to the left of that, our info button, which is kind of an add-on from the crosshair. You can navigate along these different days and lines and get an exact percentage. As we look here at the tender reject index, you can get an exact percentage of what you're looking at as you navigate the line. And again, this is something that's kind of an add-on from our crosshair right to the left of there. That'll let you navigate there, and we'll give you a value there on the right-hand side of the screen as you navigate with the crosshair function. From there, right to the left, in our studies function, we can add different studies as we look at different charts and as we compare different chart functions. One good one here is a moving average line, which you can define by the period that you'd like to look at. So I'm going to do 14 days here, and I'm going to leave the rest of these fields in their default section here. And as you can see, it's kind of just a half line here. That's because I put it on a 14-day moving average. So if I zoom in and do a month here on my x-axis, it'll give me a better idea of what exactly that line is showing. So here we can just look at, if you want a little closer view based on the last month or 14 days in this case, what that moving average is for this tender rejection index, and kind of the valleys and peaks and things to note as we move along that line. And I don't think we have any questions here. We're coming pretty close to the end, as I'm going to move along in these last couple add-ons in the chart function, or different views you can have. And again, if you'd like to delete this study that you just did, you can right-click on that and you can delete that study and bring you back to your normal page. From our display, we're currently looking at our chart in a mountain view. Another good one that we like to use is our baseline view, which will show, based on the time period that you're looking at, the indice will show you the values above or below the average in that time period. So as you can see, if we change the time frame, we'll get this kind of red part of the graph showing us below our average line. So that's again under display, and you can also look at from a line if you just like a simple line graph. Our default setting is the mountain. We like to look at our graphs and our charting function in that manner. And here's a list of all the views that I've pulled up throughout this time, so I can kind of, if I want to X out of those and not show them, they're saved here, so I can do so. Or I can save a view if I've created, let's say, this moving average line. I can save that view from this function. And with that, I think we're run right about to the end, and we're about out of time. Again, in the top right-hand corner, if you don't already have a contact at FreightWaves for someone on our SONAR team, if you click on this contact us email button, you will get in contact with someone on the SONAR team, and we will be able to reach out to you and address any questions, concerns, or feedback you may have so far navigating the SONAR platform. And with that, we appreciate you tuning in to the webinar, and we will see you next week at 2 p.m. Thank you.